In the harsh winter of 1873, a young woman stepped off a stagecoach in the remote mining town of Silver Peak, Montana. Her thin cotton dress was no match for the biting cold, and her shivering hands clutched just one small bag containing everything she owned in the world. The locals stared at the stranger, this delicate flower who seemed destined to wither and die in their unforgiving landscape. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 20 years later, they would call her the Queen of the Frontier, a woman who transformed a lawless mining camp into a thriving community, saved countless lives during the Great Blizzard of '78, and built an empire from nothing but determination and grit. This is the remarkable story of Abigail Watson, a desperate mail-order bride who arrived with empty pockets, but whose legacy would echo through generations. Eleanor Parker sat at her modest desk in Boston, fingers trembling as she sealed the letter that would forever change her fate. At 22, she had been dealt a cruel hand by life. Orphaned, penniless, and with time running out at the boarding house, where she'd been struggling to pay rent by working as a seamstress. "You have 2 weeks to settle your debts, Miss Parker," Mrs. Holloway had warned that morning, her thin lips pressed into a severe line. "I've been patient, but I can't run a charity." Eleanor knew what happened to young women who couldn't pay their way in 1873 Boston. The streets were unforgiving, and the factories were death traps that consumed young women's health for pennies a day. She had only one option left, an advertisement she'd found in the back pages of the Boston Herald. Wives wanted. Strong, virtuous women of good character sought by successful frontiersmen in Montana Territory. Passage paid upon acceptance. The letter she had just sealed contained everything she could offer. A daguerreotype showing her plain but pleasant features, references to her character from her former employer, and a desperate promise to be hard-working and loyal. Her destination, Mr. Jackson Sullivan, Silver Peak, Montana Territory. 3 weeks later, Eleanor found herself on a westbound train, clutching the letter that had changed everything. Mr. Sullivan's response had been brief but promising. "Your character seems suitable. Passage enclosed. I require a woman to maintain my household and provide companionship. Silver Peak offers opportunity to those willing to work." The journey west stripped Eleanor of any romantic notions she might have harbored. The train was crowded and filthy, and her fellow passengers regarded her with suspicion when they learned she was traveling to meet a husband she'd never seen. A group of women in Kansas City had whispered loudly enough for her to hear. Another, desperate one, selling herself to some brute in the territories. Eleanor had nearly turned back then, but where would she go? Boston held nothing but destitution, and at least in Montana she would have a roof over her head and food to eat. She forced herself to remember her father's words before fever took him. "Sometimes courage isn't about being fearless, Ellie. It's about being terrified but moving forward anyway." As the landscape outside her window transformed from the lush green fields of the Midwest to the stark, wild beauty of the Western Territories, Eleanor felt her old self being stripped away. By the time she boarded the final stagecoach to Silver Peak, the refined Boston girl was gone, replaced by a woman who had endured 6 days of travel with little food and less sleep. "Silver Peak just over that ridge," the stagecoach driver announced on the 7th day, pointing to a jagged mountain in the distance. Not much to look at, but the silver mine's been good to the men who survived to work it. Survived. The word echoed ominously in Eleanor's mind. The stagecoach crested the final hill, revealing a scatter of wooden buildings clinging to the mountainside like desperate children. Smoke rose from crude chimneys, and men in dirt-caked clothes milled. Around what appeared to be a saloon, this was to be her home. "Last stop, Silver Peak," the driver called out, pulling the horses to a halt in what passed for the town square. Eleanor descended from the coach on trembling legs, the bitter December, cold cutting through her thin dress. She had sold her coat 3 days earlier to buy food when her provisions ran out. Now, as snowflakes began to fall, she clutched her single bag, containing a spare dress, her mother's Bible, and a small silver hairbrush that was her only inheritance. The coach pulled away, leaving her alone in the snow. Men stopped to stare at her, their gazes making her clutch her bag more tightly to her chest. "You lost, miss," a gruff voice called out. Before Eleanor could answer, a tall figure emerged from the largest building in the square. He moved with purpose, his broad shoulders straight despite the cold wind that whipped his long coat around his legs. As he approached, Eleanor's heart sank. Jackson Sullivan was at least 20 years her senior, with a face weathered by sun and wind. His dark beard was streaked with grey, and a long scar ran from his left temple to his chin. "Miss Parker." His voice was deep and rough like gravel underfoot. Eleanor managed a nod, forcing herself to meet his gaze. His eyes were an unsettling pale blue, assessing her as one might evaluate livestock. "You're smaller than I expected," he said finally. "Not much use in the kitchen garden or for carrying water." Eleanor straightened her back. "I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Sullivan, and I learn quickly." A hint of something, respect, perhaps, flickered in his eyes before disappearing. "You see, come along, storm's coming in." He didn't offer to take her bag or her arm, simply turning and expecting her to follow. Eleanor hurried after him, acutely aware of the eyes that followed their progress through the muddy street. They walked past the saloon, where piano music mingled with raucous laughter, past a general store with windows glazed with frost, and toward a cluster of houses on the edge of town. Sullivan's home was larger than the others, 2 stories of rough-hewn timber with glass windows, a luxury in this remote place. As they approached, Eleanor noticed the careful construction, the solid foundation, and the neat stack of firewood along one wall. Whatever else Jackson Sullivan might be, he was not a careless man. "This will be your home now," he said, opening the door. "If you prove satisfactory." The interior was surprisingly warm, heated by a large stone fireplace where flames crackled invitingly. The main room was sparsely furnished but clean, with a wooden table and chairs, a couple of bookshelves filled with volumes, and a rocking chair near the fire. The floors were swept, but there was a layer of dust on the mantelpiece and windowsills. "Your room is upstairs," Sullivan said, hanging his coat on a peg by the door. "Mine is down here." He gestured to a closed door off the main room, and Eleanor felt a wave of relief. At least he didn't expect her to share his bed immediately. "I run the assay office and own part interest in the Silver Queen mine," he continued, watching her. "Examine the room. I'm gone from sunrise to sunset most days. You'll be responsible for maintaining the house, cooking meals, and mending clothes. Can you cook?" "Yes," Eleanor said, though her experience was limited to helping in the boarding. "House kitchen? Good. There's a lean-to kitchen out back. Pump for water is in the yard. Root cellars stocked for winter." He pointed to another door. "Outhouse is 50 paces behind the house. Snow gets deep, so I've strung a rope line to follow in blizzards." Eleanor nodded, trying to absorb all this information while still shivering. In her thin dress, Sullivan frowned. "Where's your coat?" I had to sell it," she admitted, "for food on the journey." His frown deepened. "Foolish. You'll freeze to death in a Montana winter without proper clothing." He crossed to a trunk in the corner and pulled out a wool blanket. "Wrap yourself in this for now. Tomorrow we'll see about getting you proper attire." Eleanor accepted the blanket gratefully, wrapping it around her shoulders. "Are you hungry?" he asked. She hadn't eaten since a meager breakfast on the stagecoach. "Yes, sir." Sullivan nodded and moved to the kitchen lean-to. Eleanor followed hesitantly, watching as he expertly stoked a cast-iron stove and placed a pot of stew over the heat. "Usually have this ready when I return home," he said, the statement clearly an expectation for the future. "Bread's in the tin there." They ate in silence, Eleanor too exhausted and overwhelmed to make conversation, Sullivan seemingly content with the quiet. The stew was simple but filling, venison with root vegetables, and Eleanor ate until her bowl was empty. "Thank you," she said when she finished. Sullivan merely nodded. "You should rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." He showed her to a small but clean bedroom upstairs. A narrow bed with a straw mattress stood against one wall, a washstand with a pitcher and basin against another. A small window looked out over the mountains, now obscured by the falling snow. "There's extra blankets in the chest," Sullivan said. "Winter nights get cold enough to freeze the blood in your veins." With that cheerful thought, he left her alone, his heavy footsteps retreating down the stairs. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, still wrapped in the wool blanket. What had she done? Who was this stern, scarred man she had promised to marry? What would become of her in this wild, remote place? She unpacked her meager belongings, placing her mother's Bible on the small table beside the bed. Then, too tired to even cry, she crawled under the blankets, fully dressed, and fell into an exhausted sleep. Morning came with blinding brightness as sunlight reflected off fresh snow. Eleanor woke, disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the unfamiliar ceiling above her brought reality crashing back. She rose quickly, remembering Sullivan's warning about a long day ahead. She washed her face in the icy water from the pitcher, changed into her only other dress, and pinned her hair neatly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Downstairs, she found the main room empty, but a fire was already burning in the grate. On the table was a note weighted down by a coin. "Gone to work. Return at midday to introduce you to town. Use coin for necessities at Mason's General Store. Coffee in blue tin." Eleanor pocketed the coin and set about exploring her new domain. The kitchen lean-to was primitive but functional, with a good stove, various cooking implements hanging from hooks and shelves stocked with basic provisions. The pump in the yard required her to break through a thin crust of ice before yielding water. The outhouse was, indeed, exactly 50 paces behind the house, with a rope line guiding the way. By mid-morning, Eleanor had swept the floors, dusted the neglected surfaces, and discovered the extent of the housekeeping that had been neglected. In Sullivan's bachelor existence, she had just put coffee on to boil when the front door opened. Sullivan stamped snow from his boots and hung his coat. If he noticed the improved cleanliness of his home, he gave no indication. "Come," he said. "Time you met the town." He handed her a heavy coat, far too large for her frame but wonderfully warm. "Mrs. Whitaker down the way passed last month. Her husband said you might as well have this, since she has no more need of it." Eleanor accepted the dead woman's coat with murmured thanks, trying not to think about the omen it might represent. Silver Peak, in daylight, was marginally less forbidding than it had appeared the previous evening. The main street consisted of the saloon, which Eleanor now saw bore the name The Silver Nugget, Mason's General Store, a barber shop that advertised hot baths for 25 cents, the assay office where Sullivan worked, a small church, and various other businesses catering to the miners. The houses clustered around this main street, with more primitive cabins scattered up the mountainside toward the entrance to the Silver Queen mine. Sullivan walked with purpose, nodding occasionally to men they passed. Some looked curiously at Eleanor, while others ignored her completely. Women were scarce. She counted only 3 during their entire walk through town. "Mason's first," Sullivan announced, leading her into the general store. The proprietor was a round man with spectacles and a surprisingly refined accent for the frontier. "Sir, Mr. Sullivan, and this must be your correspondence bride?" "This is Miss Eleanor Parker," Sullivan said, "soon to be Mrs. Sullivan if arrangements prove satisfactory to both parties." Eleanor felt herself redden at being discussed like a business transaction. "Miss Parker needs proper clothing for winter," Sullivan continued, "and whatever else women require." He stepped back, clearly expecting Eleanor to handle the details. With the coin he had left her and Sullivan's apparent credit at the store, Eleanor selected warm stockings, sturdy boots, a woolen dress, undergarments, and a knitted scarf. Each item was extravagantly priced, the cost of transporting goods to this remote location, and she was careful not to abuse Sullivan's generosity. Their next stop was the assay office, a solid building where miners brought ore samples to be tested for silver content. Sullivan introduced Eleanor to his assistant, a young man named Thomas, who seemed in awe of his employer. "Miss Parker will be handling household matters," Sullivan told the young man. "If I'm needed at home, you'll find me there." The day continued with introductions to the town doctor, a grizzled man who doubled as the dentist, the preacher, absent as he rode a circuit between 5 mountain towns, and finally, to Eleanor's surprise, the schoolteacher. Miss Sarah Jenkins was perhaps 30, with a stern face but kind eyes. She taught in a one-room schoolhouse at the edge of town. "We have 18 children when they all attend," she told Eleanor, "from ages 5 to 14. Their education is inconsistent." "Miss Parker was educated in Boston," Sullivan said, surprising Eleanor with this acknowledgement of her background. "Perhaps she might assist you occasionally." Miss Jenkins brightened. "That would be most welcome. I've been alone in this endeavor for 3 years." Their final stop was the home of Mrs. Margaret Wilson, one of the few married women in Silver Peak. Her husband owned the general store, and she greeted Eleanor with genuine warmth. "Another woman? Praise the Lord," she said, ushering them inside. "I was beginning to think I'd never have female companionship in this wilderness," Mrs. Wilson insisted. They stayed for tea, during which she provided Eleanor with more practical information about surviving in Silver Peak than Sullivan had offered. She explained the rhythm of the mining town, the dangers of winter storms, where to find wild berries in summer, and which men to avoid when they came down from the mines on payday. "You've chosen well, Mr. Sullivan," she told Eleanor's soon-to-be husband. "She has good eyes, keen, observant." Sullivan merely nodded, but Eleanor sensed he was pleased with Mrs. Wilson's assessment. As they walked back to Sullivan's house, her house now, Eleanor supposed, she gathered her courage to ask the question that had been burning in her mind. "Mr. Sullivan, when do you intend for us to marry?" He glanced at her, those pale blue eyes unreadable. "The circuit preacher comes through the first Sunday of each month. If we both find the arrangement satisfactory, we'll marry then." A month. She had a month to prove herself satisfactory, or what? Would he send her back east? Leave her to fend for herself in this harsh place? The thought made her shiver despite the heavy coat. That evening Eleanor cooked their first meal, together, a simple affair of salt pork and beans with the last of the bread. Sullivan ate without comment, but he cleaned his plate entirely, which she took as a positive sign. After dinner, he surprised her by taking a book from the shelf and offering it to her. "You can read, yes?" "Of course," Eleanor said slightly, offended by the question. "Good. Read aloud then. Winter nights are long in Silver Peak." The book was a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets, its binding worn from frequent handling. Eleanor opened to a page marked with a scrap of paper and began to read, her voice gaining strength as she continued. When she glanced up after several sonnets, she found Sullivan watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Your voice is pleasing," he said finally. "Continue." And so established their evening routine. After dinner, Eleanor would read aloud while Sullivan carved intricate patterns into pieces of wood or repaired items around the house. Sometimes he would explain the workings of the mine or the assay office. Occasionally, he asked about her life in Boston, listening intently to her answers but offering little of his own past in return. Days passed, and Eleanor settled into the rhythm of frontier life. She learned to manage the temperamental stove, discovered which vegetables kept best in the root cellar, and developed calluses from pumping water and carrying wood. Twice a week, she assisted Miss Jenkins at the schoolhouse, finding unexpected joy in teaching the rough-and-tumble mining children their letters and sums. Gradually, she began to transform Sullivan's house into a home. She sewed curtains from fabric purchased at Mason's, arranged wildflowers in jars when the snow retreated enough to find them, and convinced Sullivan to help her move furniture to create a more welcoming space. He complied with these requests without complaint, and Eleanor sometimes caught him looking at her handiwork with what might have been approval. As the first Sunday of February approached, the day the circuit preacher was due to arrive, Eleanor found herself torn. Part of her had come to appreciate the ordered existence she shared with Jackson Sullivan. He was fair, if not demonstrative, and she had a growing suspicion that his gruff exterior concealed a more complex man than she had initially judged him to be, but another part of her wondered if she was merely accepting her fate too readily. Was there more to life than this quiet existence in a remote mining town? What dreams was she surrendering by binding herself to this man and this place? The night before the preacher's expected arrival, Sullivan broke their routine by speaking after dinner rather than asking her to read. "Tomorrow the preacher comes," he said, his voice oddly hesitant. "We should discuss our arrangement." Eleanor set the book aside, her heart racing. "Yes, I suppose we should." Sullivan studied his hands for a moment before meeting her gaze. "You've proven capable. The house is well kept. The meals are good. You've made yourself useful to the community with the teaching." Such romantic praise, Eleanor thought wryly, but remained silent. "I believe you would make a suitable wife," he continued, "but I have no wish to trap you in an unwanted marriage. If you find the prospect of remaining in Silver Peak as Mrs. Sullivan disagreeable, I will purchase your ticket back east." The offer stunned Eleanor. She had not expected him to provide her with a choice. In the past month, she had come to understand that Jackson Sullivan was a fair man, but this level of consideration surprised her. "And if I choose to stay?" she asked carefully. Something flickered in his pale eyes. "Then we will marry tomorrow, and you will have the protection of my name and the security of my home. I cannot promise you wealth, but I can promise you will never want for necessities, and I can promise you respect." "Not love?" The question slipped out before Eleanor could stop it. Sullivan's expression darkened. "I had a wife once. She came west with grand expectations and found only disappointment. The winter of '65 took her and our unborn child." His voice grew rough. "I do not speak of love easily, Miss Parker, but I can offer partnership, protection, and purpose." In that moment, Eleanor saw behind the mask of the stern, scarred man to the grief he carried. She thought of Boston, of the life she had left behind, the hunger, the desperation, the looming threat of destitution. And she thought of the past month in Silver Peak, difficult, yes, but also filled with small satisfactions, new skills learned, and the beginnings of respect from both Sullivan and the townspeople. "I will stay," she said simply. "I will marry." "You tomorrow?" Sullivan nodded, his relief evident, though he tried to conceal it. "Very well. We should both rest. Tomorrow will bring change for us both." As Eleanor climbed the stairs to what would be her bedroom for the last night before becoming Mrs. Sullivan, she wondered what the future held. She was under no illusions. Life in Silver Peak would be hard, the winters brutal, the comforts few. Jackson Sullivan was not an easy man, carrying wounds both visible and hidden. But perhaps, Eleanor thought as she looked out her window at the star-strewn sky above the mountains, perhaps there was strength to be found in this harsh place. Perhaps there was purpose in creating order and beauty in this wild frontier. Perhaps in time there might even be something that, if not love, could grow into a bond of mutual respect and caring. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Eleanor Sullivan, wife of a frontier mine owner, resident of Silver Peak. It was not the future she had imagined for herself, but as she prepared for bed, Eleanor realized it was a future she was increasingly ready to embrace, with all its hardships and all its possibilities. The morning of Eleanor's wedding dawned clear and bitterly cold. She stood at her bedroom window, watching the sun transform the snow-covered mountains into glittering diamonds, aware that this moment marked the division between her old life and whatever lay ahead. Downstairs, she found Sullivan already dressed, in his finest, a black wool suit that had seen better days but had been meticulously brushed clean. He looked up when she entered, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Wilson will arrive shortly to help you prepare," he said. "I've business at the assay office before the ceremony." Eleanor nodded, grateful for the time to gather her thoughts. After Sullivan departed, she sat in the rocking chair by the fire, attempting to calm her racing heart. What did she really know about the man she was about to marry? He was fair, hard-working, and respected in town. But he was also scarred, inside and out, by a past he rarely discussed. Mrs. Wilson arrived with a flurry of excitement, carrying a package wrapped in brown paper. "A wedding requires a proper dress," she announced, revealing a gown of deep blue wool. "It was my sister's. She's back in Ohio now. Never suited her coloring, but it will be perfect with your auburn hair." The dress fit well enough with only minor adjustments. Mrs. Wilson helped Eleanor arrange her hair, weaving blue ribbons through the intricate braids she created. When they finished, Mrs. Wilson stepped back with satisfaction. "You'll do just fine, dear. Sullivan's a good man, better than most in these parts. Keeps his word and his temper, which is rare enough among the mining folk." The ceremony took place in the small church, attended by a curious assembly of townspeople. The circuit preacher, Reverend Hayes, was a weathered man with kind eyes, who spoke the traditional words with genuine warmth. Sullivan stood straight-backed beside Eleanor, responding clearly when required, his voice never wavering. When it came time to seal their vows with a kiss, Sullivan hesitated, then leaned forward to place a brief, chaste kiss on Eleanor's lips, their first physical contact, beyond an occasional brush of hands. His beard tickled her skin, and she caught the scent of pine soap and something uniquely him. A modest celebration followed at the Silver Nugget, which had been cleared of its usual rowdy patrons for the occasion. The saloon owner, a boisterous man named Frank Murphy, presented them with a cake baked by his wife. "To the new Mrs. Sullivan," he toasted, raising a glass of whiskey. "May she bring beauty and grace to our humble establishment whenever she honors us with her presence." The miners and townspeople cheered, more enthusiastic about an excuse for celebration than about the marriage itself, Eleanor suspected. Still, several people approached to offer congratulations, including Thomas from the assay office, Miss Jenkins, and even the town doctor. "You've married a legend, you know," the doctor told her quietly. During the avalanche of '69, Sullivan dug through 20 feet of snow with his bare hands to reach trapped miners. Saved 5 men when everyone else had given up. His hands were frostbitten so badly I thought he'd lose fingers. Eleanor glanced at her new husband, who was deep in conversation with the owner of the general store. She had noticed the scarring on his hands, but had never asked its origin. There was clearly more to Jackson Sullivan than met the eye. As the celebration wound down, Sullivan approached, offering his arm. "Shall we return home, Mrs. Sullivan?" Mrs. Sullivan. The name sounded foreign to her ears, as if he were addressing Someone else. They walked home in the fading light, snowflakes beginning to fall around them. Neither spoke, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. When they reached the house, Sullivan paused at the threshold, then surprised Eleanor by scooping her into his arms and carrying her inside. "Tradition," he muttered, his cheeks flushed beneath. His beard. Once inside, he set her down carefully and stepped back, suddenly awkward. Eleanor realized he was as uncertain as she was about what came next. "I'll prepare dinner," she said, moving toward the kitchen. "No." Sullivan's voice stopped her. "Not tonight. I've arranged something." From a cupboard, he produced a bottle of wine and 2 slightly mismatched glasses. "From California," he explained. "Ordered it special from Mason's." Eleanor watched in amazement as he then retrieved a basket containing bread, cheese, and preserved fruits. Luxuries in Silver Peak, especially. In winter, "A wedding feast," he said almost shyly. They sat before the fire, sharing this modest but meaningful meal. The wine loosened Sullivan's usual reserve, and he spoke more freely than ever before, telling Eleanor about his journey west after the war, his discovery of silver in the mountains, and the early days of Silver Peak. It was just tense then, he said. Men living like animals, fighting over claims and rotting from scurvy because nobody thought to eat anything but beans and bacon. I saw the potential for something more. "Is that why you built this house?" Eleanor asked. "Because you saw the potential for something more than a mining camp." Sullivan studied his glass. "I built it for my first wife, Rebecca. She deserved better than a tent or a crude cabin." His voice grew distant. "She never saw it completed." Eleanor felt a pang of sympathy. "I'm sorry for your loss, Jackson." It was the first time she had used his given name, and his eyes snapped to hers, startled but not displeased. "It was long ago," he said finally. "But yes, I continued building because I believed Silver Peak could become a proper town, not just a temporary camp. Men work better, live better, when they have homes and community." As the evening progressed, the question of sleeping arrangements loomed larger. Finally, Sullivan addressed it directly. "I've prepared my room for you, for us," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "But I can sleep by the fire if you prefer. I have no wish to rush you." Eleanor appreciated his consideration, but she was also pragmatic. They were married now. "Your room, our room, will be fine." The bedroom downstairs was larger than her previous room, dominated by a substantial bed with a handmade quilt. Sullivan had cleared space in the wardrobe for her few belongings and added a second washstand. When it came time to retire, he turned his back politely while she changed into her nightgown, then extinguished all but one candle before removing his own. Clothes down to his long underwear. Even in the dim light, Eleanor could see the extent of the scarring on his body. Not just his face and hands, but his arms and torso as well, telling tales of hardships she could only imagine. He joined her beneath the heavy quilts, maintaining a careful distance. "Good night, Mrs. Sullivan," he said formally. "Good night, Jackson," she replied. In the darkness, she felt him shift slightly closer, his hand finding hers beneath the covers. It wasn't passion, but it was a beginning, an acknowledgement of their new bond, fragile but real. Spring arrived suddenly in Silver Peak, the snow retreating. Up the mountainsides, as if chased by the warming sun. With the thaw came new challenges and opportunities. The population of the town swelled as miners who had wintered elsewhere returned to their claims, bringing with them an increased demand. For services, Eleanor found herself busier than ever. Beyond her duties as Sullivan's wife, which now included sharing his bed in more than just name, their physical relationship having evolved into something surprisingly tender, if not precisely passionate, she had taken on additional responsibilities in the community. The schoolhouse had become a second home. Miss Jenkins welcomed Eleanor's assistants 3 days a week, allowing them to separate the younger children from the older for more focused instruction. Eleanor discovered she had a talent for teaching, particularly mathematics, which she had always enjoyed. "You're a natural," Miss Jenkins told her after watching Eleanor explain fractions using pieces of slate broken into different sizes. "The children respond to you." Word of Eleanor's skill spread, and soon adult minors were appearing at the schoolhouse. Dr. After Hours, sheepishly requesting help with figures so they could better track their earnings and expenses. Eleanor began offering evening lessons twice weekly, charging a modest fee that she used to purchase books and supplies for the school. Sullivan supported these endeavors with quiet pride. "You're becoming a fixture in town," he observed one evening, as they walked home from the schoolhouse together. "People look to you now." At home, Eleanor had transformed their living space completely. Gone were the Spartan furnishings and bachelor simplicity. In their place were handmade curtains, braided rugs, and carefully tended plants that brought color and life to each room. She'd convinced Sullivan to add a proper porch where they could sit on summer evenings, watching the sunset paint the mountains, gold and purple. She'd also taken over a small plot behind the house for a kitchen garden, coaxing vegetables from the rocky soil with determined patience. Mrs. Wilson had become a close friend, teaching Eleanor the frontier skills she lacked: how to preserve food for winter, which wild plants were edible or medicinal, and how to predict weather changes by watching the behavior of animals. "You're thriving here," Mrs. Wilson remarked, as they picked wild berries on a warm June afternoon. "Some women wither in these mountains, but you're blooming." Eleanor considered this assessment. She had arrived in Silver Peak desperate and afraid, seeing it as merely a haven from destitution. Now, not even 6 months later, she realized she had built something meaningful, not just a marriage or a home, but a place for herself in this community. Her relationship with Sullivan had evolved as well. The stern, scarred man who had met her stagecoach remained reserved by nature, but his walls had lowered considerably. He sought her opinion on matters related to the mine, listened attentively to her suggestions for improving conditions in the miners' quarters, and occasionally, when they were alone, revealed glimpses of a dry humor she found surprisingly delightful. One evening in late June, as they sat on their new porch watching twilight settle over the mountains, Sullivan broached a subject that took Eleanor by surprise. "Mason received a shipment of lumber today," he said, apparently focused on whittling a piece of pine into what would eventually become a chess piece. He was crafting a set, a project he worked on in rare moments of leisure. "Enough to build an addition to the house." Eleanor glanced at him curiously. "An addition? What for?" Sullivan kept his eyes on his work, but his hands stilled. "I thought perhaps a nursery might be prudent to plan ahead." The implication hung in the air between them. They had never discussed children, though their marriage had become a true one in all senses. Eleanor had begun to wonder if Sullivan, after losing his first wife in childbirth, was opposed to the idea of becoming a father. "A nursery," she repeated carefully. "Yes, I suppose planning ahead would be wise." Sullivan finally looked up, his pale eyes searching her face. "Would that please you, children?" Eleanor felt a surge of emotion, hope, fear, longing. "Yes," she admitted. "I've thought of it often, especially working with the children at the school, but I wasn't sure if you—" "I feared it once," he said quietly, "after Rebecca. But now—" He set aside his whittling. "You've brought life back to this house, Eleanor. Perhaps it's time to bring even more." Their lives soon fell into a new rhythm as Sullivan began work on the addition. The town buzzed with speculation. The Sullivans must be expecting already, though Eleanor knew this wasn't yet true. Still, she found herself hoping, watching for signs each month. July brought scorching heat and troubling news. A new vein discovered in the Silver Queen mine had attracted attention from a large mining concern based in Denver. Representatives arrived in Silver Peak, making inquiries about property ownership and mineral rights. Vultures, Sullivan muttered after a particularly tense meeting. They're offering to buy out my share of the mine for half what it's worth, claiming they'll modernize operations and increase production. Will they? Eleanor asked. Perhaps, but they'll also bring in their own men, push out the local miners, and bleed the mountain dry without care for what happens to Silver Peak when the silver runs out. And he paced their living room, agitated. This town needs sustainable growth, not a boom that will leave a ghost town behind. Eleanor considered this problem. During her months of teaching, she had learned much about the town's economy and the precarious nature of mining communities. What if, she suggested hesitantly, we diversified before they arrive in force? Sullivan paused, his pacing. Diversified how? Silver Peak sits on the main route to 3 other mining camps, Eleanor pointed out. We could establish businesses that serve travelers and transport. A proper hotel, an expanded general store with wholesale capabilities, perhaps even a small smelter so the raw ore doesn't have to be shipped elsewhere for processing. Sullivan stared at her, his expression shifting from surprise to consideration. You've given this thought? I listen to the miners who come for arithmetic lessons, Eleanor explained. They talk about their frustrations, having to travel 2 days to reach a smelter, paying exorbitant prices for goods, because Mason's is the only store for 50 miles. There's an opportunity there. That night, Sullivan spread maps across their dining table, marking transportation routes, nearby settlements, and resources. It could work, he said finally, but it would require capital, more than we currently have. What about partners? Eleanor suggested. Frank Murphy has been complaining that the saloon is too small for the summer crowd. Mrs. Wilson mentioned her husband has been corresponding with his brothers back east about investment opportunities. Sullivan looked at her with newfound respect. You've built quite a network of intelligence in this town, Eleanor smiled. People talk to teachers and wives. They don't guard their words as they might with the mine owner. The next weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Sullivan called a town meeting at the church, presenting a vision for Silver Peak's future that incorporated Eleanor's ideas while addressing the looming threat from the Denver Mining Company. To her surprise, he insisted she stand beside him, acknowledging her contribution openly. Mrs. Sullivan has identified opportunities we've overlooked, he told the assembled townspeople. If we act quickly, we can secure Silver Peak's future, regardless of what these outsiders decide. The response was cautiously positive. Frank Murphy immediately pledged to invest in a hotel if others would join him. Mason, the store owner, expressed interest in expansion. Even the reluctant town doctor agreed that a proper clinic might attract a younger physician to share his growing workload. You've started something significant, Sullivan told Eleanor as they walked home that night. They listened because it made sense, but they acted because they've come to respect you. August brought both progress and peril. Construction began on the hotel and the expanded general store. Sullivan's addition to their house neared completion, a bright nursery with windows positioned to catch the morning sun. Eleanor still wasn't with child, but the possibility seemed to grow more real with each nail hammered into the nursery walls. The Denver Company, however, had not abandoned their interests. 2 representatives returned, this time with a team of surveyors and a letter from the territorial governor expressing support for development initiatives in the region. They're planning to bypass us entirely, Sullivan reported after confronting them. They've purchased land south of town and intend to establish their own settlement, New Prosperity they're calling it, with a direct rail connection to Denver. The news sent a ripple of anxiety through Silver Peak. A competing town with rail access could drain away business, miners, and eventually the lifeblood of their community. Eleanor refused to surrender to pessimism. "Then we accelerate our plans," she said firmly. "We need that smelter operational before they break ground on theirs, and we need to secure water rights for the entire valley." Sullivan raised an eyebrow. "Water rights? Miss Jenkins has been teaching the children about the importance of watersheds," Eleanor explained. "This entire valley depends on the streams coming down from the north face. If we control those water rights, any new settlement would need to negotiate with us." Sullivan's expression transformed from concern to something like awe. "You continue to surprise me, Mrs. Sullivan." "I should hope so, Mr. Sullivan," she replied with a small smile. "A predictable wife would be terribly dull." He pulled her close then, a rare public display of affection. "You are many things, Eleanor Sullivan, but dull has never been among them." That night, as they lay in bed discussing strategies for securing the water rights, Eleanor felt a curious sensation, a fluttering in her abdomen, faint but unmistakable. She placed a hand over the spot, waiting. Sullivan noticed her sudden stillness. "What is it? Are you unwell?" "No," she whispered, taking his hand and placing it where hers had been. "Wait." For several long moments, nothing happened. Then, just as Sullivan began to withdraw his hand, the fluttering came again, stronger this time. His eyes widened. "Is that—" Eleanor nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Our child." Sullivan's scarred face transformed, years of hardness melting away, as he gazed at her with naked wonder. "Our child," he repeated, his voice rough with feeling. In that moment, as Sullivan's calloused hand rested protectively over their growing child, Eleanor felt a surge of fierce determination. She had come to this wild place with nothing, desperate and alone. Now she had a husband, a home, a purpose, and soon a child. She had found not just survival in Silver Peak, but the chance to build something lasting. The Denver Company and their plans for new prosperity weren't just a threat to the town. They were a threat to everything she and Sullivan were building, to the future they envisioned for their family. Eleanor resolved then that she would not allow anyone to undermine Silver Peak's potential. She would fight for this town as fiercely as she would fight for her own child. "We'll secure those water rights tomorrow," Sullivan said, his hand still, resting on her abdomen. "And then we'll gather the town leaders to accelerate the smelter construction." Eleanor nodded, her mind already racing ahead to next steps, potential obstacles, necessary alliances. "The Denver Company has money and political connections," she said thoughtfully, "but we have something they don't." "What's that?" "We have people who are fighting for their homes, not just profits." Eleanor covered his hand with hers. "And now we have even more reason to ensure Silver Peak doesn't just survive, it thrives." As the baby moved again beneath their joined hands, Eleanor and Sullivan exchanged a look of profound understanding. The battle for Silver Peak's future had only just begun, but they would face it together, the mine owner and his mail-order bride, now partners in every sense of the word. And Eleanor, who had arrived with nothing but a small bag and desperate hopes, felt the first stirrings of the strength and determination that would one day lead the people of Silver Peak to call her there. Green September brought golden aspen leaves to the mountainsides and renewed determination to Silver Peak. Eleanor's pregnancy had become common knowledge, eliciting a wave of goodwill throughout the community. Women brought handmade baby clothes and shared folk wisdom about childbirth and infant care. Men tipped their hats to her with newfound respect, speaking in hushed tones when she passed, as if her condition granted her a sacred status. Sullivan had secured the water rights to the northern streams, registering them quietly in Helena before the Denver Company realized their strategic importance. The town council, A newly formed body that included Sullivan, Frank Murphy, Mason, and unexpectedly Eleanor as secretary, met weekly to coordinate their defense against the encroaching threat of new prosperity. Their surveyors have mapped the valley floor, Sullivan reported during an October meeting held in the back room of Mason's expanded store. They're bringing in equipment to break ground before the first snow. How many men? Frank Murphy asked, puffing on his pipe. 20. Initially, with more to follow once construction begins. Eleanor, taking notes in her precise handwriting, looked up. Where will they stay? Their settlement won't have housing yet. The men exchanged glances. It was still unusual for a woman to speak in such meetings, especially one in a delicate condition. But they had learned that Eleanor's questions often revealed overlooked considerations. They'll need lodging, she continued. Food, supplies, basic services. Mason leaned forward, his spectacles catching the lamplight. You're suggesting we provide these necessities? Aid our competitors? At a premium, Eleanor clarified. If we control their access to essential services during the initial phase, we can monitor their progress while generating revenue to fund our own improvements. Sullivan's mouth quirked in the half-smile that Eleanor had come to recognize as pride. Keep your enemies close, he murmured, and charge them handsomely for the privilege, Frank added with a hearty laugh. The strategy proved effective. When the Denver Company's advance team arrived in late October, they found Silver Peak transformed from the rough mining camp they had expected. The new hotel, though not yet complete, offered clean rooms at exorbitant prices. Mason's expanded store stocked the necessary supplies at triple the usual markup. Even the Silver Nugget had been renovated with a separate dining room offering. Meals that, while simple, were far superior to trail cooking. They're fuming, Sullivan reported after meeting with the Denver Company's foreman, but they have little choice unless they want to house their men in tents as winter approaches. Eleanor, now visibly showing her pregnancy in her 6th month, adjusted the ledger books spread across their dining table. She had taken on the financial management of Sullivan's interests, revealing a talent for numbers that impressed even the territorial bank representative who occasionally visited Silver Peak. Their expenses are mounting while their progress lags, she observed, reviewing the carefully tracked accounts. The early snow last week delayed their supply wagons. If we're fortunate, they won't have foundations laid before winter truly sets in. Sullivan placed a hand on her shoulder, a casual intimacy that had become natural between them. Fortune favors the prepared, and thanks to you, we're more prepared than they anticipated. The first major snowfall arrived in mid-November, earlier than usual and heavier than expected. The Denver Company's construction site became a quagmire of mud and frozen ground, their equipment rendered useless by the conditions. Their foreman, a red-faced man named Wilson, stormed into the assay office, demanding Sullivan sell them additional lumber from the town's supply. "You've cornered the market," he accused. "There's not a board to be had between here and Helena." Sullivan maintained his composure. "We purchased what we needed for our own projects. Perhaps better planning on your part might have prevented your current predicament." Word spread quickly that the Denver Company's men were considering abandoning the site until spring. Eleanor saw an opportunity and suggested Sullivan host a town gathering at the newly completed hotel. "Invite their workers," she urged. "Let them see what Silver Peak offers: warm lodging, good food, a community that looks after its own." The gathering, ostensibly a celebration of the hotel's completion, served its strategic purpose perfectly. While the Denver Company's management remained aloof, their workers mingled freely with Silver Peak's residents. Eleanor moved among them, her condition making her appear harmless, while she skillfully directed conversations toward the benefits of permanent settlement in an established community. "My husband is always seeking skilled men for the Silver Queen," she mentioned to a group of surveyors. "Men who understand both mining and construction are particularly valuable. We believe in fair wages and profit sharing for those who demonstrate loyalty. By December, 5 of the Denver company's workers had applied for positions in Silver Peak. By January, that number had doubled. The Denver company's regional manager arrived in a fury, summoning Sullivan to a confrontation at the hotel. Eleanor insisted on accompanying her husband, despite the heavy snow and her advancing pregnancy. "This concerns both of us," she said firmly when Sullivan protested. "Besides, they may underestimate a woman in my condition. That could work to our advantage." The meeting took place in the hotel's private dining room. The manager, Howard Green, was a polished man in an expensive suit that seemed ludicrously out of place in the frontier setting. His smile vanished when he saw Eleanor enter behind Sullivan. "This is a business discussion, Mr. Sullivan. Perhaps your wife would be more comfortable elsewhere." "Mrs. Sullivan is my partner in all matters," Sullivan replied coolly. "She stays." Green's displeasure was evident, but he proceeded to outline the Denver company's grievances: employee poaching, price gouging, and interference with their development plans. Eleanor listened attentively, one hand resting on her swollen abdomen, the other taking occasional notes. When Green finished his accusations, Sullivan turned to her. "Mrs. Sullivan, your thoughts?" Surprise flickered across Green's face as Eleanor closed her notebook and addressed him directly. "Mr. Green, your company arrived in our valley with no communication, no consideration for an existing community, and a stated intention to establish a competing settlement that would inevitably damage Silver Peak's economy," she said calmly. "You assumed we would simply stand aside while you threatened our livelihoods and our homes." Green's expression hardened. "Business is business, Mrs. Sullivan. Sentimentality has no place in progress." "On the contrary," Eleanor countered. "What you dismiss as sentimentality, community bonds, loyalty, shared purpose, these are assets your company clearly undervalued. You offered your workers higher wages, but failed to provide decent living conditions. You spoke of progress, but showed no concern for sustainable development. The people of Silver Peak are not opposing progress, Mr. Green. We're defining what progress means in our home." The manager's face flushed with anger. "Pretty words, but the reality is your little town can't compete with our resources. This delay is temporary." Sullivan leaned forward. "Perhaps, but consider this. Your operation has hemorrhaged money for 3 months, with nothing to show but frozen mud and deserting workers. Meanwhile, our smelter will be operational by March. Our hotel is already profitable, and our mine continues to produce while yours remains theoretical." The standoff continued through January, with the Denver company maintaining a skeleton crew at their site, while most of their workers either returned to Denver or found employment in Silver Peak. Eleanor used this respite to advance her own project, a proper medical clinic to replace the doctor's cramped office. "A mining town needs proper medical facilities," she argued at a town council meeting, "especially with a growing population." The town's aging doctor, initially skeptical of Eleanor's interference, had become one of her strongest supporters after she organized a system for obtaining medical supplies from Helena on a regular schedule. When Eleanor went into labor during a fierce February blizzard, his gratitude manifested in unwavering attention throughout her difficult 20-hour delivery. Sullivan paced the floor of their home like a caged mountain lion, periodically shouting through the bedroom door to ask for updates. When the doctor finally emerged, exhausted but smiling, Sullivan nearly collapsed with relief. "You have a son, Mr. Sullivan," the doctor announced, "and a remarkably strong wife." The boy, named William after Eleanor's father, arrived squalling and robust despite his early appearance. Sullivan, when finally allowed to enter the bedroom, approached the bed with uncharacteristic uncertainty. Eleanor, pale but triumphant, placed their son in his trembling hands. "He has your eyes," she whispered, noting the pale blue that already showed in the infant's gaze. Sullivan cradled the tiny form with reverent care. "But your determination, I think. Look how he grips my finger, already stubborn, for a precious." Few weeks, the battle with the Denver Company receded into the background as Eleanor and Sullivan absorbed the wonder and exhaustion of new parenthood. The town celebrated William's birth as a communal victory, the first child born to a prominent family in Silver Peak in over a decade, a symbol of the community's resilience and future. March arrived with warming temperatures and renewed conflict. The Denver Company, having replaced their local management, launched a new strategy. Instead of competing with Silver Peak directly, they attempted to purchase controlling interests in its key businesses, the hotel, the general store, and most alarmingly, shares in the Silver Queen mine. "They're offering Thomas 3 times the value of his stake," Sullivan reported grimly, referring to his assistant, who owned a modest 5% of the mine. "He's considering it." Eleanor, nursing William in the rocking chair by the fire, looked up sharply. "If Thomas sells, others will follow. We need to counter their offer." "With what?" "We've reinvested most of our profits in the smelter and the water system. We don't have liquid capital to match their price." Eleanor considered the problem, gently burping the baby against her shoulder. "What about a different form of ownership? If the miners themselves held stakes in the Silver Queen, their loyalty would be to Silver Peak, not to outside investors." Sullivan stared at her. "A cooperative ownership structure. That's unorthodox." "So is a woman on the town council," Eleanor pointed out with a small smile. "Unorthodox approaches have served us well so far." The proposal faced resistance from some of the wealthier mine shareholders, but garnered enthusiastic support from the miners themselves. Under the new arrangement, workers could earn ownership stakes through years of service, creating a path to prosperity that the Denver Company couldn't match with mere wages. Thomas withdrew his consideration of the Denver Company's offer, declaring publicly that Silver Peak takes care of its own. Other potential sellers followed his example, effectively blocking the corporate takeover attempt. The Denver Company's response was swift and vicious. In early April, they filed legal challenges to Silver Peak's water rights, claiming prior discovery and development intentions. Simultaneously, they reduced ore prices at processing facilities they controlled in neighboring territories, attempting to strangle the Silver Queen's profitability before Silver Peak's own smelter could begin operation. "They're trying to bankrupt us before summer," Sullivan concluded after reviewing the latest financial projections. "Without cash flow from the mine, we can't complete the smelter, and without the smelter, we remain dependent on their processing facilities." Eleanor, who had developed a network of connections through her teaching and community work, called in every favor and relationship she had cultivated. Former students now working in Helena provided insider information about the Denver Company's legal maneuverings. The circuit preacher, who served congregations throughout the territory, brought news and carried messages. Even the occasional travelers passing through the hotel became sources of intelligence and potential allies. "The territorial governor is visiting Helena next month," Eleanor announced one evening after speaking with a drummer who had stopped at the hotel. "He's concerned about corporate influences in mining communities." Sullivan looked up from the maps spread across their table. "How does that help us?" "The governor's wife was once my mother's friend in Boston," Eleanor revealed. "I've written to her, explaining our situation. She's arranged an audience for us when he visits." Sullivan's eyebrows rose. "You never mentioned this connection." Eleanor shrugged, adjusting William in her arms. "It wasn't relevant until now. I've maintained correspondence with many people from my previous life. Information and relationships are resources, just like silver or timber." The meeting with the territorial governor in Helena proved pivotal. Eleanor, presenting the case for Silver Peak with eloquence and strategic documentation, emphasized not the town's private interests, but its value as a model for sustainable frontier development. What we've created in Silver Peak demonstrates how mining communities can evolve beyond the boom and bust cycle, she explained, presenting the cooperative ownership structure, the diversified businesses, and the investment in infrastructure, like the school and medical clinic. We're building a permanent settlement that will contribute to the territory's stability long after the silver runs out. The governor, impressed by both the presentation and Eleanor herself, a cultured Easterner who had adapted so successfully to frontier life, agreed to review the Denver company's legal challenges personally. He also expressed interest in visiting Silver Peak to see its developments firsthand. "You've created quite the advocate for our cause," Sullivan told Eleanor as their stagecoach rumbled back toward Silver Peak. "He couldn't take his eyes off you." Eleanor smiled, cradling William, who had weathered his first journey remarkably well. He was watching with curiosity. An Eastern lady turned frontier wife, presenting a mining policy instead of serving tea. "But if that curiosity serves our purpose, I'll gladly be the spectacle." The governor's promised visit came in late May, as wildflowers carpeted the mountain meadows and Silver Peak showed itself to best advantage. The entire town mobilized to create a positive impression. Buildings freshly painted, streets cleared. Of mud and debris, children rehearsed for a special performance at the school. Eleanor, despite having a 4-month-old constantly at her breast or hip, somehow managed to coordinate these efforts while preparing their home to host the governor for dinner. Sullivan watched her in amazement as she directed activities throughout. The town soothed the colicky William and still found time to review the latest financial reports from the mine. "How do you manage it all?" he asked, as she simultaneously nursed the baby and marked corrections on the schoolchildren's recitation program. Eleanor looked up, a flash of vulnerability breaking through her competent exterior. "Some days I'm not sure that I do, but there's so much at stake, not just for us, but for everyone in Silver Peak." Sullivan knelt beside her chair, a rare gesture of humility from the proud mine owner. "You've transformed this town, Eleanor, and me along with it." The governor's visit exceeded all expectations. Impressed by the smelter nearing completion, the orderly development, and the evident community spirit, he publicly praised Silver Peak as a model for territorial growth. More importantly, he indicated that the Denver company's legal challenges were unlikely to succeed given the clear evidence of Silver Peak's prior development and rightful water claims. The day concluded with dinner at the Sullivan home, where Eleanor served a meal that balanced frontier practicality with Eastern refinement. Venison prepared with herbs from her garden, vegetables preserved from the previous summer, and bread baked fresh that morning. The governor's aide, taking careful notes throughout the day, paid particular attention to Eleanor's management of both the conversation and the household. After the governor departed the next morning, Frank Murphy burst into the Sullivans' home with a Helena newspaper in hand. "Have you seen this?" he demanded, spreading the paper on the table. The headline read, "Governor endorses frontier innovation, Silver Peak challenges corporate mining model." The article that followed detailed the governor's visit and his favorable impressions. But what caught Eleanor's eye was a paragraph near the end. Perhaps most remarkable in this frontier success story is the role of Mrs. Eleanor Sullivan, who arrived as a mail-order bride less than 2 years ago and has since become an instrumental force in Silver Peak's development. The governor's aide remarked that while Mr. Sullivan commands the mine, it is his wife who increasingly influences the town's strategic direction, earning her the nickname the Queen of Silver Peak among territorial officials. Eleanor stared at the words, a mixture of embarrassment and pride warming her cheeks. Sullivan, reading over her shoulder, laughed softly. "It seems you've been crowned, my dear." he said, his voice rich with admiration. "Though they've underestimated your domain. Your influence extends beyond Silver Peak to the entire frontier." The Denver Company's response to the governor's endorsement and the public relations coup was predictably hostile. They launched one final offensive, an attempt to block the railroad spur that Silver Peak had been negotiating, which would connect the town to the main line being constructed 50 miles south. Without rail access, the smelter's capacity will exceed local needs, Sullivan explained to the town council. "We need to move processed ore efficiently to remain competitive." Eleanor, who had been corresponding with a college friend whose husband worked for the railroad, provided a solution. "The railroad is concerned primarily with guaranteed volume," she explained. "If we can demonstrate consistent production and community stability, they'll prefer our route to an unproven alternative." The council approved her proposal to offer the railroad a 5-year guarantee of minimum ore shipments, backed by the combined resources of Silver Peak's businesses. This cooperative approach, another innovation in a region where towns typically competed rather than collaborated internally, provided the security the railroad demanded. By July, as Silver Peak celebrated its most prosperous summer, the Denver Company admitted defeat. They sold their partially developed property to Sullivan for a fraction of their investment, retaining only a small interest in the smelter as a face-saving measure. "You've won," Green, the former manager, told Sullivan as they completed the transaction in the assay office. "Though I suspect it's your wife who orchestrated our downfall." Sullivan's scarred face revealed nothing. "Mrs. Sullivan and I are partners in all things, Mr. Green, a concept your company might have benefited from understanding." That evening, as Eleanor sat on their porch nursing William and watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of amber and gold, Sullivan joined her with 2 glasses of the same California wine they had shared on their wedding night. "To the Queen of the Frontier," he said, offering her a glass once William had fallen asleep in her arms. Eleanor accepted the toast with a smile, though she shook her head at the grandiose title. "I'm no queen, just a woman who found her place and fought to protect it." Sullivan gazed at her with the open admiration he now freely displayed. "You arrived here with nothing but determination, and you've built an empire. If that doesn't deserve a crown, I don't know what does." As they sat together in the lengthening shadows, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From desperate mail-order bride to respected community leader, from friendless outsider to the woman the newspaper had dubbed the Queen of Silver Peak. It was a transformation she could never have imagined when she stepped off that stagecoach in the bitter cold less than 2 years earlier. Yet here she was, with a husband who had become a true partner, a son who represented Silver Peak's future, and a community that had not merely accepted her, but looked to her for leadership. The challenges were far from over. Frontier life would always bring hardships and threats, but Eleanor faced the future with confidence rather than fear. A mail-order bride who had arrived with nothing now possessed something far more valuable than material wealth. She had found her kingdom, her purpose, and her power. And though she might dismiss the title with modest protests, everyone who knew Eleanor Sullivan understood the truth. The Queen of the Frontier had only just begun her reign. The 5 years following Silver Peak's victory over the Denver Company brought unprecedented prosperity to the mountain town. By 1878, the population had tripled, the Silver Queen mine operated at full capacity, and the smelter processed ore from 3 neighboring mining camps. The railroad spur, completed in the summer of 1876, connected Silver Peak to markets across the nation, transforming the once isolated settlement into a regional hub of commerce and industry. At the center of this transformation stood Eleanor Sullivan, whose reputation had spread far beyond the territorial boundaries. The nickname bestowed by the governor's aide, the Queen of the Frontier, had stuck, though Eleanor still dismissed it with a self-deprecating laugh whenever it was mentioned in her presence. No real queen would have hands this calloused, she often remarked, showing palms that still bore the marks of practical labor despite her elevated status. The Sullivan household had expanded along with the town. William, now 5, had been joined by a 3-year-old sister, Rebecca, named for Sullivan's first wife, in a gesture of healing that demonstrated how far he had come from the scarred, solitary man who had met Eleanor's stagecoach. A third child was expected in the spring, turning the once Spartan bachelor home into a bustling family residence filled with children's laughter and the organized chaos of family life. Sullivan, his business interests diversified well beyond the original mine, had constructed a new office building in town, leaving Eleanor to transform their home into a center of community life. The parlor hosted town council meetings. The dining room served as an impromptu classroom for advanced students, and the kitchen became a testing ground for preservation techniques that helped Silver Peak's residents survive the harsh mountain winters. On a crisp October morning, Eleanor sat at her desk in what had once been the nursery and was now her private study, reviewing correspondence from across the territory. At 30, she had retained her slender build despite 2 pregnancies, though the auburn hair she pinned carefully each morning now contained strands of silver that she made no attempt to disguise. Her face, once soft with youth, had acquired the defined character that comes from facing challenges and overcoming them, with fine lines at the corners of her eyes, speaking of both laughter and determination. A knock at the door interrupted her concentration. "Come in," she called, expecting William's tutor with a question about the day's lessons. Instead, Sullivan entered, his expression grave. Though still powerfully built at 50, the years had whitened his once dark beard and deepened the lines of his weathered face. The scar that had once seemed so fearsome to Eleanor now registered merely as a familiar feature of the man she had come to love deeply. "What is it?" she asked, immediately alert to his troubled demeanor. "Weather report from the high country," he said, placing a telegram on her desk. "Early storms building, heavier than usual." Eleanor scanned the message, her brow furrowing. After the success of their water rights strategy years earlier, she had established a network of observers throughout the surrounding mountains, providing Silver Peak with advance warning of weather patterns, flood risks, and snowpack conditions. This intelligence system had saved lives and property multiple times, earning her further respect among frontier communities. "Second telegram this week, warning of unusual conditions," she noted. "Have you spoken with the mining camps at higher elevations?" Sullivan nodded. "Ordered evacuation of the highest sites already, but Hammond at Eagle Peak is resisting, says they're close to a major strike and won't abandon the dig." Eleanor pressed her lips together in disapproval. Marshall Hammond, owner of the Eagle Peak operation, was notorious for prioritizing profit over safety. His camp, situated at nearly 9,000 feet, housed 30 miners and their families in hastily constructed shelters that Eleanor had condemned as death traps during her single visit there the previous summer. "We can't force them to evacuate," Sullivan continued, "but I've sent wagons up to bring down anyone willing to leave." "And supplies?" Eleanor asked, already calculating needs in her mind. "Loading as we speak. I've cleared space in the hotel and the meeting hall for temporary housing. Thomas is coordinating with Mason to ensure food reserves." Eleanor rose, moving to the large map of the region that dominated one wall of her study. Colored pins marked settlements, mining operations, and key transportation routes, her strategic overview of the territory she had come to think of as under her protection. If the storms are as bad as predicted, we'll need to prepare for more than Eagle Peak, she said, tracing potential trouble spots with her finger. Rockfall risk here, avalanche danger there. The railroad could be blocked for weeks. Sullivan watched her analysis with the respect of a man who had learned to trust his wife's judgment implicitly. What do you recommend? Full winter protocols. Initiated immediately, not next month as planned. Coal and firewood stockpiles increased by 30%. Medical supplies inventoried and supplemented, and she hesitated, knowing her next suggestion would be controversial. We should consider mandatory rationing from the outset rather than waiting for shortages to develop. Sullivan nodded slowly. The merchants won't like it. They'll like starvation. Even less, Eleanor replied crisply. I'll speak with them this afternoon. We've established enough trust over the years that they should understand the necessity. She turned from the map, her mind shifting to family concerns. William's birthday celebration next week may need to be postponed. He'll be disappointed, Sullivan said, though they both knew their son would understand. At 5, William already showed signs of inheriting both his father's physical strength and his mother's sharp intellect and sense of duty. Better disappointed than endangered, Eleanor said, her hand unconsciously moving to her swollen abdomen where their third child grew. I'll explain it to him myself. The predicted storms arrived with a vengeance 2 days later, dropping 3 feet of snow on Silver Peak in a single night and isolating the higher camps completely. Eleanor's preparations proved prescient as the temperature plummeted to record lows, and continued snowfall made travel impossible. From their home, converted partially into an emergency management center, Eleanor coordinated Silver Peak's response to the crisis. Years of community building had created a resilient town with well-established emergency protocols, allowing them to weather the initial onslaught better than many neighboring settlements. A week into what would later be called the Great Blizzard of '78, the first refugees from outlying areas began straggling into town, frost-bitten, exhausted miners from camps that had ignored evacuation warnings. Among them were 3 men from Eagle Peak, their harrowing tale confirming Eleanor's worst fears. Hammond refused to shut down operations even after the first storm, one man reported, as the town doctor treated his severely frostbitten hands. Said it would pass like any other. By the time he realized this was different, the trails were already impassable. How many remain at the camp? Eleanor asked, maintaining her composure despite the horror she felt. 27, including 6 women and 4 children, the miner replied. Food was already running low when we left. The main shelter's roof collapsed under the snow 2 days ago. They've crowded into the remaining buildings, but without adequate heating. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Without rescue, the people at Eagle Peak would freeze or starve, perhaps both. That evening, Eleanor convened an emergency meeting of Silver Peak's leadership in her dining room. The situation at Eagle Peak dominated the discussion, with opinions divided on whether rescue was possible given the continuing storms and treacherous conditions. The pass is buried under at least 15 feet of snow, Frank Murphy argued. No, wagon could get through, and individual riders would be suicide missions. So we leave them to die, Eleanor challenged, her voice sharp. There are children up there. The room fell silent, the weight of the decision heavy on every shoulder. Sullivan, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke. Not wagons, sleds. All eyes turned to him. Norwegian miners in the northern camp built snow sleds last winter, wide runners, dog teams. They used them to transport light loads of ore when the trails were snowed under. Eleanor immediately grasped the potential. Are they here? The Norwegians, Sullivan nodded, evacuated the day before the storm hit. 4 men with 2 sleds. Could they carry supplies up, bring people down? Possibly. It's still incredibly dangerous. The avalanche risk alone. Eleanor stood, decision made. Find the Norwegians. Ask for volunteers, but make it clear what they're facing. We'll need medical supplies, concentrated food, brandy, extra blankets, everything packed for maximum supply with minimum weight. As the meeting dispersed to implement her directives, Sullivan remained, his pale eyes studying her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You should rest," he said quietly, nodding toward her pregnancy. "You've been on your feet coordinating relief efforts for days." Eleanor shook her head. "I can rest when those children are safe. Besides, the baby isn't due for months." Sullivan recognized the futility of arguing with his wife when her mind was set. Instead, he simply said, "I'll be going with the rescue party." Eleanor stilled, her heart constricting. "Jackson!" "I know the terrain better than anyone except the Norwegians," he said, his tone making it clear the decision was final. "And I won't ask men to take risks I won't face myself." Though fear clutched at her, Eleanor understood. This was the man she had married, a man of principle and courage. To ask him to remain safely in Silver Peak while others risked their lives would diminish him in his own eyes. "Then you'll need this," she said, removing the silver locket she always wore, a gift from Sullivan on the birth of their first child. Inside was a small family portrait, the only one they possessed. "Bring it back to me." Sullivan took the locket, closing his scarred hand around it tightly. "I will." The rescue mission departed before dawn the next morning. 4 Norwegian miners with their specially designed sleds, Sullivan, the town doctor, and 3 experienced mountaineers from Silver Peak who volunteered despite the risks. Eleanor stood in the swirling snow to see them off, William clutching her hand tightly as the dog teams disappeared into the storm. For 3 days, Silver Peak waited for news, the tension mounting as the storm continued unabated. Eleanor maintained a facade of calm efficiency, overseeing the town's emergency operations while privately wrestling with fear for her husband and the stranded families. On the 4th day, as Eleanor was conducting an inventory of the town's remaining medical supplies, a commotion erupted outside. She rushed to the door to find a crowd gathering in the main street despite the still falling snow. Down from the mountain trail came the rescue party, or what remained of it. 2 of the Norwegian sleds were laden with bundled figures. The rescued, women and children from Eagle Peak, wrapped in every available blanket. Behind them struggled the remaining miners, supporting each other through the deep snow. At the rear came Sullivan, carrying a small child in his arms, the doctor at his side attending to the little one as they moved. Eleanor's heart soared at the sight of her husband, apparently unharmed, even as she noted the grim set of his jaw that told of difficulties overcome and losses sustained. The town mobilized instantly, following the emergency protocols Eleanor had established years before. The rescued were taken to the hotel where warm rooms and hot food awaited. The injured were transported to the clinic where Eleanor had insisted on installing modern medical equipment despite its expense. Those suffering from frostbite and exposure received immediate treatment under the doctor's direction. Sullivan found Eleanor organizing care for a mother and infant who had been among the rescued. When their eyes met across the room, no words were needed. The relief and love that passed between them transcended speech. He crossed to her, pressing the silver locket into her palm with fingers still stiff from cold. 23 rescued, he reported, his voice hoarse from shouting. Over the storm winds. 3 days of digging to reach the collapsed shelter. 4 didn't make it, Hammond among them. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, acknowledging the losses even as she gave thanks for those saved. And our men lost 1 sled and team to an avalanche. Lars Eriksson was injured, broken leg but alive. The others are exhausted but otherwise intact. Later that night, with the rescued settled and the immediate crisis managed, Sullivan described the mission in detail as Eleanor tended to his frostbitten extremities in the privacy of their bedroom. Without the Norwegians and their sleds, it would have been impossible, he admitted, wincing as she applied the doctor's prescribed ointment to his damaged fingers. And even then, we nearly turned back on the second day when the trail disappeared, completely beneath new snow. "What made you continue?" Eleanor asked softly. Sullivan's weathered face softened. "I thought of you, your determination when faced with obstacles. The Queen of the Frontier doesn't surrender, so neither could I." Eleanor smiled at the reference, though her eyes remained serious. "The name they give me, it's not about power or authority. It's about responsibility. Those people at Eagle Peak were my responsibility, just as everyone in Silver Peak is." "I know," Sullivan said, capturing her hand in his despite the pain it must have caused him. "That's why it suits you." The great blizzard of '78 continued for 3 more weeks, dropping over 12 feet of snow and creating drifts that reached second-story windows in parts of town. When spring finally arrived, the melting revealed both destruction and opportunity, damaged buildings to repair, new flood control measures needed, but also freshly exposed mineral deposits and new grazing land where avalanches had cleared the forests. Eleanor approached these challenges with the same methodical determination that had defined her response to the blizzard. Under her guidance, Silver Peak not only recovered, but expanded, incorporating lessons from the disaster into improved building codes, emergency protocols, and community support systems. The successful rescue of the Eagle Peak survivors elevated Eleanor's status from respected local leader to territorial legend. Newspapers as far away as Chicago reported the story, embellishing details but capturing the essence of what had occurred. A community led by an unlikely heroine had accomplished what many considered impossible. In June, as wildflowers reclaimed, the mountainsides and the last of the snow retreated to the highest peaks. Eleanor gave birth to her 3rd child, a daughter with her father's pale blue eyes and already displaying the determined set of her mother's chin. They named her Victoria, a name meaning victory, that acknowledged both their triumph over the brutal winter and the new life that represented Silver Peak's future. The territorial governor, fulfilling a promise made during the height of the crisis, arrived in July to formally recognize Silver Peak's service during the blizzard. In a ceremony held in the town square, he presented citations to the rescuers and a special commendation to Eleanor, who attended with infant Victoria in her arms, and her older children at her side. "Mrs. Eleanor Sullivan," the governor proclaimed to the assembled crowd, "exemplifies the finest qualities of frontier womanhood, courage, intelligence, and unwavering dedication to community. The territory officially recognizes her as the Queen of the Frontier, a title she has earned through actions that have saved countless lives and built a model community from wilderness." Though she accepted the certificate with grace, Eleanor used her brief remarks to redirect the praise to the community itself. "Silver Peak's strength lies not in any individual, but in our bonds with one another," she said, her clear voice carrying across the square. "What we've built here, what we saved during the blizzard, belongs to all of us. My children will inherit not just property or businesses, but a legacy of mutual support and common purpose." That evening, as Sullivan sat on their porch carving a toy for Victoria while William and Rebecca played in the garden, Eleanor joined him with a letter that had arrived by the day's mail. The return address showed a Boston law firm she had contacted months earlier. "It's done," she said, handing him the document. "The Eleanor Sullivan Foundation is officially established. When the Silver Queen mine eventually runs dry, its remaining assets will fund the foundation in perpetuity." Sullivan scanned the legal language, understanding immediately what his wife had accomplished. "Education, medical care, and business development grants for frontier communities," he read aloud. "Your legacy will outlast the silver." Eleanor gazed out at the town that had become her domain, the neat rows of houses climbing the mountainside, the school where she still occasionally taught, the smelter puffing steady smoke, the clinic that had saved so many lives during this blizzard. Beyond the buildings, she saw the people moving about their evening routines, many of whom she knew by name, all of whom she considered under her protection. Not bad for a desperate mail-order bride who arrived with nothing but a small bag and fading hope, she mused, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Sullivan set aside his carving and drew her close, mindful of the sleeping infant in her arms. "You never arrived with nothing, Eleanor," he corrected gently. "You brought courage, intelligence, and vision. The bag was irrelevant." As twilight painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold, Eleanor leaned into her husband's embrace, content in the knowledge that the foundation she had established would extend her influence long after her own time passed. Generations of frontier communities would benefit from the structures and systems she had created, the lessons she had learned through trial and triumph. The Queen of the Frontier had built an empire not of conquest, but of cooperation, not of subjugation, but of mutual support. It was an achievement no one could have predicted when she stepped off that stagecoach into the bitter cold, but one that would echo through the mountains long after the silver veins ran dry and the pioneer era faded into history. In that moment, cradling her youngest child while her older children played in the garden of the home she had transformed, Eleanor Sullivan, once Eleanor Parker of Boston, desperate and alone, felt the full measure of the journey she had undertaken and the legacy she would leave behind. It was not the life she had imagined when she sent that fateful letter to a stranger named Jackson Sullivan, but it was a life of purpose, impact, and deep fulfillment. The mail-order bride had become a queen, not through birthright or marriage, but through the quiet power of determined action and unwavering vision. Her domain was not marked on any official map, but its influence would be felt throughout the frontier for generations to come, an empire built of silver, stone, and the indomitable human spirit. Mail-order bride arrived with nothing now. They call her the Queen of the Frontier. Part 5. Legacy of the Queen. The summer of 1883 marked the 10th anniversary of Eleanor's arrival in Silver Peak. The town had transformed beyond recognition from the crude mining camp she had encountered. On that bitter December day a decade earlier, now a prosperous hub of commerce and industry, Silver Peak boasted brick buildings along its main street, a proper courthouse with a clock tower, a school with 3 full-time teachers, and a population approaching 2,000 souls. Eleanor Sullivan, at 35, had likewise transformed. The frightened, desperate young woman from Boston had become a confident, respected figure whose influence extended throughout the territory. Her family had grown, William now 10, Rebecca 8, Victoria 5, and 2-year-old Thomas completed. The Sullivan brood, each child displaying a unique blend of their parents' characteristics. Sullivan himself, approaching 60 but still vigorous, despite the white that had completely overtaken his once dark beard, had gradually stepped back from direct management of their business interests, focusing instead on territorial politics, where his straightforward approach and reputation for integrity had made him an effective advocate for frontier communities. This shift left Eleanor increasingly in control of the family's extensive holdings. The Silver Queen Mine, the smelter, shares in the railroad, the Silver Peak Bank, established 5 years earlier, and numerous smaller ventures throughout the region. She managed these interests not from an imposing office, but from her study at home, balancing ledgers and dictating correspondence, while still maintaining her role as mother, community leader, and the woman still universally known as the Queen of the Frontier. On a warm August morning, Eleanor sat at her desk reviewing plans for the anniversary celebration the town had insisted on holding, despite her protests that such recognition was unnecessary. A knock at the door interrupted her concentration. "Come in," she called, expecting her secretary with the mail. Instead, Abigail Henderson, wife of the railroad station manager, entered with an expression of barely contained excitement. At 30, Abigail represented the new generation of Silver Peak women, educated, engaged in community affairs, and inspired by Eleanor's example to pursue interests beyond traditional domestic roles. "Mrs. Sullivan, forgive the intrusion," Abigail began, "but I've just received a telegram from my sister in Denver that I thought you should see immediately." Eleanor accepted the paper, scanning its contents quickly. Newspaper reporting, President Arthur to tour Western Territories. Stop specific mention of Silver Peak as potential visit. Stop formal announcement, expected tomorrow. Stop. "The President of the United States," Eleanor said, stunned despite her usual composure. "Coming here?" Abigail nodded enthusiastically. "My sister works as a secretary to the territorial representative. She says it's been quietly arranged for weeks but kept confidential for security reasons." Eleanor's mind raced, calculating the implications and necessary preparations. President Chester Arthur was known for his interest in territorial development and had supported legislation beneficial to frontier communities, but a presidential visit to a former mining camp was unprecedented. "Thank you, Abigail," she said, rising. "Please, keep this confidential until we receive official notification. Then we'll need to convene the town council immediately." After Abigail departed, Eleanor moved to the window of her study, gazing out at the town she had helped build. A presidential visit would bring unprecedented attention to Silver Peak, attention that could attract new investment, immigrants with needed skills, and political support for the region's continued development. It was an extraordinary opportunity, but also an enormous responsibility. She was still contemplating the news when Sullivan returned from his morning ride, having spent the early hours inspecting a new irrigation system being constructed on the valley floor. Despite his political activities, he remained fundamentally a builder, most content when overseeing practical improvements to the community. "You look preoccupied," he observed, noting her thoughtful expression. "Something in the anniversary plans not to your liking?" Eleanor shared Abigail's telegram, watching Sullivan's weathered face register the same surprise she had felt. "If it's true, we have perhaps 2 weeks to prepare the town for presidential scrutiny," she concluded. Sullivan ran a hand through his white beard, a habit unchanged from their earliest days together. "The timing is remarkable. 10 years since you arrived to transform Silver Peak, and now the president comes to witness what you've built." "What we've built," Eleanor corrected gently, though they both knew her vision had been the driving force behind Silver Peak's evolution, and with the help of every citizen who chose to make this place their home. The official notification arrived the following day, confirming that President Arthur would indeed visit Silver Peak during his western tour, with an expected arrival date just 12 days hence. The town exploded into activity, buildings freshly painted, streets resurfaced, special committees formed to address everything from security to the menu for the presidential dinner. Eleanor found herself at the center of this whirlwind, coordinating efforts while attempting to ensure the visit showcased not just Silver Peak's prosperity, but the innovative community model they had pioneered. She insisted that the presidential itinerary include not only the mine and industrial facilities, but also the school, the medical clinic, and the cooperative farming project in the valley. "The president should see that we're building more than businesses," she told the planning committee. "We're creating a sustainable community that will thrive even when the silver eventually runs out." As preparations continued, Eleanor received another unexpected communication, a letter bearing a Boston postmark and a return address that sent a chill through her despite the summer heat. The law firm of Harrington and Webb had represented the owners of the boarding house where she had lived before fleeing west. She hadn't heard that name in a decade. With fingers that suddenly trembled slightly, Eleanor opened the envelope. The formal language of the legal profession initially obscured the message, but as she read further, the import became clear. Mrs. Holloway, the boarding house owner who had threatened eviction all those years ago, had died. In a surprising twist, her will specified that Eleanor Parker, her maiden name, was to receive a modest inheritance. Apparently, the stern woman had privately admired the desperate young woman's courage in seeking a new life. Eleanor sat back, a complex mixture of emotions washing over her. The inheritance itself was insignificant compared to the wealth she and Sullivan had built, but it represented an unexpected reconciliation with her past, an acknowledgement from the very person whose ultimatum had driven her to become a mail-order bride. She was still contemplating this ironic turn when William burst into the study, his face flushed with excitement. At 10, he was the image of Sullivan in his younger days, with the same powerful build and direct gaze, though his expressions often revealed Eleanor's quick intelligence. "Mother, the decorations committee can't decide whether to use territorial or national flags on Main Street, and Miss Jenkins says they need your opinion immediately," he announced with the gravity of a child entrusted with an important mission. Eleanor tucked the Boston letter into her desk drawer, returning to the present with a smile for her eldest. "Tell Miss Jenkins I'll be there directly. And, William," she added as he turned to leave, "remind your sisters that we need to fit their new dresses for the presidential reception this afternoon." The boy nodded seriously before racing off, his boundless energy a reminder of how quickly time had passed. Eleanor glanced at the framed photograph on her desk, a family portrait taken the previous Christmas, showing Sullivan seated with Thomas on his lap, flanked by Eleanor and their 3 older children. From a desperate bride with nothing to a mother of 4 with a presidential visit to manage, the journey seemed almost mythological in its scope. The 12 days before President Arthur's arrival passed in a blur of preparations, community meetings, and the usual family demands that Eleanor refused to neglect despite the extraordinary circumstances. Sullivan, drawing on his political connections, provided valuable intelligence about the president's interests and concerns, helping Eleanor craft a presentation of Silver Peak that would resonate with their distinguished visitor. The morning of the presidential visit dawned clear and mild, with a crispness to the air that hinted at the approaching autumn. Eleanor rose before sunrise, reviewing her notes one final time before awakening the children for their specific roles in the day's events. William would present a gift from the schoolchildren, Rebecca would recite a poem of welcome, and even Victoria had been practiced in a perfect curtsy. Only Thomas, at 2, was exempt from formal duties. Sullivan found her in the kitchen, already dressed in a deep blue gown that had been specially made for the occasion by Silver Peak's finest seamstress. The color brought out the auburn still, predominant in her hair despite the increasing strands of silver, and the elegant cut emphasized the grace she had developed over years of community leadership. "The Queen of the Frontier indeed," Sullivan said appreciatively, taking in her appearance. "President Arthur will be thoroughly impressed." Eleanor shook her head at the familiar nickname, though she had long since stopped actively protesting. "I'm more concerned that he understands what we've accomplished here, not just the prosperity, but the model of cooperative development that could benefit other frontier communities." Sullivan's eyes softened with the pride he no longer attempted to conceal. "He will. The evidence is undeniable." The presidential train arrived precisely at noon, its polished engine and elegant cars creating a stark contrast with the original stagecoach that had delivered Eleanor to Silver Peak a decade earlier. President Arthur, a tall, distinguished figure, with impressive whiskers and impeccable attire, descended to a carefully orchestrated welcome, the town band playing, school children waving flags, and a formal greeting committee headed by Sullivan in his capacity as territorial representative. Eleanor, standing slightly behind her husband as protocol dictated, watched the president's face as he took in the scene. His expression registered genuine surprise at the sophistication of the welcome and the evident prosperity of what had been. Described to him as a former mining camp in the mountains, the formal introductions proceeded smoothly until Sullivan turned to present his wife. "Mr. President, may I introduce Mrs. Eleanor Sullivan, my wife and the founder of many of the institutions you'll be visiting today." President Arthur's eyebrows rose slightly as he extended his hand to Eleanor. "Ah, the famous Queen of the Frontier. Your reputation precedes you, Mrs. Sullivan. I've heard remarkable accounts of your leadership during the blizzard of '78 and your innovative approach to community development." Eleanor accepted his handshake with a composed smile, refusing to be flustered by the presidential attention. "You honor us with your visit, Mr. President. Silver Peak looks forward to sharing our experience as a model for sustainable frontier development." The president's approving nod suggested she had struck the right note, respectful but confident, acknowledging his authority while subtly establishing her own expertise on the subject at hand. What followed was a meticulously planned tour of Silver Peak's key institutions, with Eleanor gradually moving from the traditionally appropriate position of supportive wife to a more active role, as the president's questions revealed genuine interest in the community structures she had helped create. At the school, Miss Jenkins, now the principal of an expanded 3-room facility, proudly demonstrated how students of different ages and backgrounds received practical education alongside traditional academics. "Mrs. Sullivan established our curriculum herself," she explained, as the president observed a class practicing agricultural calculations. She believed frontier children needed both classical knowledge and practical skills. At the medical clinic, the town doctor, a younger man, who had been recruited 5 years earlier to apprentice with the aging original physician, showcased equipment and techniques rarely found outside major cities. Our preventative care program, initiated by Mrs. Sullivan after the blizzard, has reduced mortality rates by nearly 40%, he reported proudly. By the time they reached the community center and cooperative market, President Arthur was openly directing his questions to Eleanor rather than Sullivan, recognizing where the detailed knowledge resided. Sullivan, far from being offended, watched with evident satisfaction as his wife expertly explained the economic and social systems they had developed. "The cooperative ownership model creates investment in the community's future," Eleanor explained, as they toured the market where miners' families sold agricultural products grown in the valley. "When the silver eventually runs out, Silver Peak won't become another ghost town because we've diversified our economy and given citizens a stake in multiple ventures." The president nodded thoughtfully. "A model that could address problems we're seeing throughout the Western Territories, boom towns that collapse when resources are depleted, leaving economic devastation and social dislocation." "Precisely, Mr. President," Eleanor confirmed. "We've documented our approaches specifically to provide templates for other communities. The Eleanor Sullivan Foundation exists to share these models and provide seed funding for similar initiatives." Elsewhere, President Arthur's interest visibly deepened. "I'd be very interested in reviewing these documents, Mrs. Sullivan. There may be applications for federal policy." The day culminated in a formal dinner at the newly completed Silver Peak Hotel, where the president was seated between Sullivan and Eleanor. As the meal progressed, the conversation turned from Silver Peak's specific accomplishments to broader questions of territorial development, women's education, and the future of the American frontier. Eleanor, finding herself engaged in substantive policy discussions with the President of the United States, reflected momentarily on the extraordinary path that had led her to this moment. From a desperate young woman fleeing poverty to a community leader discussing national policy, the transformation seemed almost unbelievable. As dessert was served, President Arthur addressed her directly. "Mrs. Sullivan, I must confess that reports of your accomplishments reached me even before plans for this tour were finalized. Your approach to frontier development has attracted attention in Washington." Eleanor maintained her composure despite her surprise. "I'm honored to hear that, Mr. President. In fact," he continued, "I've been authorized to discuss a proposition with you. The Department of the Interior is forming a commission on territorial development and community sustainability. Your experience and demonstrated success make you an ideal candidate for appointment." The unexpectedness of the offer momentarily rendered Eleanor speechless, a rare occurrence that Sullivan observed with a small smile. "Such a role would require periodic travel to Washington and visits to communities throughout the territories," the president added, "but would provide a platform to influence policy at the highest levels." Eleanor gathered her thoughts, acutely, aware of Sullivan and the community leaders listening intently from nearby tables. "I'm deeply honored by your confidence, Mr. President. May I ask what specifically attracted your administration's interest in our work here?" The president considered this question carefully before answering. "Mrs. Sullivan, America's frontier doesn't lack ambition, resources, or individual fortitude. What it lacks is vision, the ability to build communities that transcend immediate extraction of resources. What you've created in Silver Peak demonstrates that frontier settlements can evolve into permanent, prosperous communities with proper planning and leadership." He gestured to the assembled town leaders. "Most importantly, you've created systems that don't depend solely on any individual, even yourself. That's the mark of truly visionary leadership and exactly what the commission needs." As the evening concluded and the president retired to his private car on the train, Eleanor and Sullivan walked home through the town they had built together. The streets of Silver Peak were illuminated by gas lamps, another innovation Eleanor had championed, casting a warm glow on buildings that had evolved from crude wood structures to substantial brick and stone establishments. "Will you accept the appointment?" Sullivan asked as they passed the school where Eleanor had first found her place in the community. She considered the question seriously. "It would mean time away from the children, from you, from day to day. Management of our interests here, all of which can be managed," Sullivan pointed out. "William is already learning the business. The younger children have excellent tutors. And I'm quite capable of surviving a few weeks without my wife occasionally, though I wouldn't choose to." Eleanor smiled at his gentle humor, a side of him that had emerged gradually over their years together. "It would be an opportunity to extend what we've built here, to influence how other frontier communities develop." "The Queen's domain is expanding," Sullivan observed. They reached their home, no longer the simple structure Sullivan had built for his first wife, but an elegant residence that combined frontier practicality with tasteful refinements. On the porch, Eleanor paused, looking back over the town spread below them. "I arrived here with nothing," she said softly. "Desperate, afraid, seeing Silver Peak as merely shelter from destitution." Sullivan took her hand, his scarred fingers intertwining with hers in the gesture that had become a symbol of their partnership. "And now the President of the United States seeks your counsel on building the nation's future." The following morning, as the presidential train prepared for departure, Eleanor delivered her decision personally. Standing on the platform with Sullivan at her side, she formally accepted the appointment with one condition. "My primary residence must remain Silver Peak," she stipulated. My effectiveness derives from continued immersion in the practical realities of frontier life. I cannot advise from an ivory tower in Washington. President Arthur readily agreed, adding with unexpected warmth, Mrs. Sullivan, your story will inspire generations of Americans. From a mail-order bride arriving with nothing to a national advisor on community development, it embodies the very promise of our frontier. As the train pulled away from the station, Eleanor stood with her family gathered around her, Sullivan, their 4 children, and the extended family of community members who had joined in their journey. The mail-order bride, who had stepped off a stagecoach into the bitter cold a decade earlier, had indeed become a queen, not through birthright or conquest, but through vision, determination, and the ability to transform desperate circumstances into extraordinary opportunity. The queen of the frontier had built her kingdom, secured its future, and now would help shape the larger nation of which it was a part. Not bad, Eleanor thought with quiet satisfaction, for a woman who had arrived, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate hope for survival. As she turned to lead her family back home, the mountain sunlight caught the silver strands in her auburn hair, creating what many who witnessed it later described as a natural crown upon the brow of the woman who had transformed not just her own destiny, but the destiny of the American frontier itself. Spring 1893 brought a flurry of activity to Silver Peak as the town prepared for a momentous occasion, the 20th anniversary of Eleanor's arrival. Now a prosperous city of nearly 5,000 souls, Silver Peak had evolved far beyond its origins as a crude mining camp, boasting paved streets, electric lighting, a small college, and a reputation as one of the most progressive communities. In the West, Eleanor Sullivan, at 45, had worn the mantle of the Queen of the Frontier for so long that few remembered a time before she held the title. Her service on the Presidential Commission had expanded her influence throughout the Western Territories, with dozens of communities adopting the Silver Peak model of cooperative development and sustainable growth. The anniversary celebration coincided with another significant milestone, the graduation of the first class from Silver Peak College, an institution Eleanor had founded 5 years earlier to provide higher education specifically tailored to frontier needs. The graduating class included not only local youth, but students from throughout the territories, drawn by innovative programs in mining engineering, agricultural science, and frontier medicine. Sullivan, now 70 and finally showing his age, after a lifetime of physical labor, watched with undisguised pride as Eleanor addressed the graduates from the steps of the college's main building, a stately structure of local stone named Sullivan Hall in recognition of the family's contributions. "You enter a world of unprecedented opportunity and responsibility," Eleanor told the assembled graduates, her voice still clear and commanding despite the years. "The American frontier is no longer just a place of resource extraction, but a laboratory for community building. Each of you carries the knowledge to create sustainable futures for settlements that might otherwise follow the boom and bust cycle we've seen too often in our nation's expansion." Among the audience sat the Sullivan children, now grown, or nearly so. William, at 20, had already taken over management of several family businesses, showing his father's practical intelligence combined with his mother's strategic vision. Rebecca, 18, was preparing to attend medical school in Denver, inspired by her work alongside Silver Peak's doctors during a scarlet fever outbreak 2 years earlier. Victoria, 15, and Thomas, 12, still lived at home but already displayed the independence and capability that characterized the Sullivan offspring. As Eleanor concluded her address to enthusiastic applause, a commotion at the edge of the crowd drew attention. A stagecoach, an increasingly rare sight in an era of railroads, pulled into the square, its wooden sides dust-covered from the journey up the mountain roads that still connected Silver Peak to more remote settlements. From The coach stepped a young woman of perhaps 20, clutching a small valise and gazing around with the wide-eyed uncertainty of a newcomer. Her dress, though neat, was clearly worn, and her posture held the tense vigilance of someone accustomed to watching for threats. Eleanor, descending from the college steps after her address, noticed the young woman immediately. Something about her stance, her apprehensive expression, triggered a powerful memory, the echo of another arrival 2 decades earlier when a desperate mail-order bride had stepped off a stagecoach into an uncertain future. Moving through the crowd with practiced grace, Eleanor approached the newcomer. "Welcome to Silver Peak," she said warmly. "I'm Eleanor Sullivan. Are you here for college?" The young woman was startled at being addressed by the very person whose speech had just concluded. "No, ma'am," she replied, her accent marking her as from the East. "I'm Clara Bennett. I've come to be married. My fiancé works at the new textile mill." Eleanor nodded, careful to keep any hint of judgment from her expression. The textile mill, established 3 years earlier as part of Silver Peak's continued economic diversification, employed primarily young men recruited from Eastern factories. "And does your fiancé know you've arrived today?" Eleanor asked gently. Clara's gaze dropped. "He expects me next week, but I had to leave Boston sooner than planned. My boarding house situation became untenable." The parallel was so striking that Eleanor felt momentarily disoriented, as if time had folded back on itself. Another young woman from Boston, another hasty departure, another arrival ahead of schedule. "Then we must find you accommodation until he can be notified," Eleanor said decisively. "Silver Peak has a policy of assisting new arrivals, particularly those who come to build their lives here." Relief flooded the young woman's face. "I can pay something," she offered quickly. "I have a little money saved." "Keep your savings," Eleanor advised. "You'll need them as you establish yourself here." She gestured to one of the college administrators who had been hovering nearby. "Miss Palmer, please escort Miss Bennett to the newcomer's lodge and notify Mr. Harris at the textile mill that his fiancée has arrived." As arrangements were made, Sullivan appeared at Eleanor's side, having observed the exchange from a distance. "History repeating itself?" he asked quietly, his pale blue eyes, still sharp despite his years, missing nothing. "With crucial differences," Eleanor replied. "She arrives to a community prepared to welcome her, with systems in place to ensure she doesn't face the same desperate choices I did." Sullivan smiled, the scar on his face long since faded to a faint line nearly lost among the wrinkles of age. The Queen's legacy and practical application. The anniversary celebrations continued throughout the day, culminating in a community dinner in the town square. Eleanor, seated at the head table with Sullivan and distinguished visitors from throughout the territory, found her attention repeatedly drawn to Clara Bennett, who had been joined by her fiancé, a serious young man, who seemed genuinely delighted by her early arrival. "Something on your mind?" Sullivan asked, noting her distraction. Eleanor turned to her husband, the man whose advertisement in a Boston newspaper had changed the course of her life. "I was thinking about beginnings," she said. "How different hers will be from mine." "Different circumstances, same remarkable potential," Sullivan observed, "though I doubt Silver Peak has room for 2 queens." After dinner, as musicians set up for dancing, Eleanor excused herself from the head table and made her way to where Clara sat with her fiancé. The young couple rose respectfully as she approached. "Mrs. Sullivan, this is James Harris," Clara introduced her. "James, Mrs. Sullivan arranged my lodging when I arrived unexpectedly." The young man shook Eleanor's hand firmly. "I'm deeply grateful, Mom. Clara's letters meant everything to me these past months, but having her here in person—" His voice trailed off, emotion evident on his earnest face. "Mr. Harris, the mill's supervisor, speaks highly of your work," Eleanor said. "Have you given thought to housing now that Miss Bennett has arrived?" The couple exchanged a glance tinged with concern. "We'll marry next week," James explained. "Until then, I've my room at the boarding house, and after, we hope to find something small to rent." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. The Newcomers' Lodge was established specifically to help couples like yourselves transition into our community. Miss Bennett can remain there until your wedding, and afterward, you'll qualify for the new Families Housing Program, reduced rent for the first year while you establish yourselves. The naked relief on their faces reminded Eleanor powerfully of how precarious new beginnings could be, how a small measure of support at the right moment could alter a life's trajectory completely. "These programs," Clara ventured hesitantly, "are they available to anyone who comes to Silver Peak?" "To anyone committed to building a life here," Eleanor confirmed. 20 years ago, I arrived as you did, ahead of schedule, resources nearly exhausted, facing an uncertain welcome. The community I found was generous but unprepared. The community you find has been deliberately structured to support new beginnings. Recognition dawned in Clara's eyes. "You were a mail-order bride too?" Eleanor smiled. "Of a sort," I responded. "To an advertisement placed by a mine owner seeking a wife. I arrived with one small bag containing everything I owned in the world." James's eyes widened. "And now they call you the Queen of the Frontier." "A grandiose title for practical work," Eleanor replied with the self-deprecation that had become her trademark response to the nickname. "But it reminds us all of what's possible when communities support individual potential." Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and older residents shared stories with newcomers about Silver Peak's evolution, Eleanor and Sullivan walked home arm in arm through streets illuminated by electric lights, a far cry from the muddy paths lit only by saloon lanterns that Eleanor had first encountered. "Quite a journey from that first day," Sullivan remarked as they passed the original assay office, now preserved as a historical building. "Did you ever imagine, when you stepped off that stagecoach, what would develop?" Eleanor laughed softly. "I was hoping merely to avoid starvation. Empire building wasn't on my mind." They reached their home, the original structure still visible at its core, but expanded and improved over the decades into a stately residence that served as both family, home and informal center of community leadership. On the porch, Eleanor paused, looking back over the town spread below them just as she had done countless times over the years. "Full circle," she murmured. "From desperate arrival to welcoming others who arrive equally desperate." Sullivan's weathered hand covered hers where it rested on the porch railing. "The true measure of success, perhaps, not what you've accumulated, but what you've made possible for others." Inside, their youngest children were already asleep, the older ones still at the celebration. In the quiet of their home, Eleanor removed the silver locket she had worn since William's birth, the one Sullivan had carried during the Great Blizzard rescue. Opening it, she looked at the family portrait it contained, now faded with the years. "We should have a new one taken," Sullivan suggested, noting her contemplation of the image. "The children have changed so much." "As have we all," Eleanor agreed, remembering the stern, scarred man who had met her stagecoach and the frightened young woman she had been. "But the essence remains." As she prepared for bed that night, Eleanor caught sight of her reflection in the mirror, the auburn hair now liberally streaked with silver, the fine lines around her eyes speaking of both laughter and determination. The desperate mail-order bride was still visible if one knew where to look, transformed but not erased by the years and experiences that had shaped her into the Queen of the Frontier. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more opportunities, more young arrivals like Clara seeking their own beginnings. Eleanor would meet them with the wisdom gained through her remarkable journey, from a woman with nothing but hope to a leader whose vision had transformed not just her own life, but an entire community, and increasingly the development of the American frontier itself. The mail-order bride who became a queen had completed the most meaningful circle of all, using her hard-won power to ensure that those who followed in her footsteps would find a path illuminated by possibility rather than darkened by desperation. It was a legacy more valuable than silver, more enduring than stone, and more meaningful than any royal title could ever be. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.